No, Dear Evan Hansen is not actually about a gay kid. Yes, it is also actually about a gay kid. This show is like Schrodinger's queerness, and we're gonna open that box and find out whether it's gay or not. Dear Evan Hansen is a musical theater show that debuted on Broadway in late 2016, later received a novel adaptation in 2017, and a movie musical adaptation in 2021, but we're not talking about the movie today because fuck that, respectfully. But at this point, I would be surprised if you hadn't at least heard the name before, even if you know nothing about the show. Especially if you've been in any queer or musical theater spaces in the last decade. For the sake of time, I'm gonna have to assume you know the meat of the plot, but for those who don't, I'll give you a pretty brief and sparse rundown. Evan Hansen is a socially anxious high school kid starting his senior year, whose therapist has assigned him to write positive letters to himself to improve his confidence. He prints off a pretty pessimistic one of these letters at the school's computer lab, and it ends up in the hands of Connor Murphy, a socially outcast bully. He offers to sign the cast on Evan's broken arm, and they have a genuine moment together as outcasts, but then Connor reads the letter Evan wrote to himself and sees Evan talking about his crush on Connor's sister, Zoe. Connor's not having any of that shit, so he storms off, Evan's letter in hand. A few days pass, and Evan's then called into the principal's office, where he meets Mr. and Mrs. Murphy. They tell him that Connor committed suicide, and they found a letter addressed to Evan with him, leading the Murphys to believe that Evan was their son's only friend. Evan tries to tell the truth, explaining he wrote the letter to himself, but the Murphys are desperate for some kind of comfort, and Evan doesn't have the heart to let them down. Thus begins a downward spiral of lies, where Evan fabricates an entire friendship with the now-deceased Connor. He confides in his family friend, Jared Kleinman, who helps him with fake emails, school assemblies, online social media organization, and fundraisers. Evan gets the girl he always wanted, Zoe Murphy, and a sense of familial belonging that he never had before. The more lies Evan tells about his non-existent friendship with Connor, the more he seems to gain from it all. Eventually, of course, he fesses up to the Murphys, and the rest of high school carries on without anyone ever learning the truth, except for Jared. And on life goes. Despite most of the marketing campaigns, and the songs themselves, when taken out of narrative context, promoting the musical as a #positive, #mental health, #you will be found story, there's a lot about that really isn't that. And it's definitely not the uplifting story of a queer kid overcoming his anxieties that the vast majority of the internet, for some reason, thought it was. It's far from an uplifting staple of queer media, but as far as most people are concerned, it's still pretty gay, right? If so many people thought it was gay, then clearly there's a reason why, isn't there? As far as I'm concerned, you're damn right there is. Even ignoring most of the overarching framing of the narrative for now, it's pretty easy to see why queer audiences latched onto the main characters. From the second the curtains open, all three are archetypes that resonate deeply with queer teens and their experiences, myself included, honestly. From the moment we see him, Evan is socially anxious, shown to be in therapy and struggling with mental illness, and desperately wants to be true to himself, but feels a deep internalized shame and doesn't exactly know how to follow through on that. And there's a certain tenseness and distance between him and his mother, Heidi. In the opening number, Anybody Have a Map, that distance feels pretty one-sided for the most part. Heidi is trying her best, but Evan doesn't know how to work with that. Ask Tumblr if you need more confirmation, but as far as I'm concerned, this touches on a lot of common queer experiences that many queer youth go through today. Mental illness, internalized shame, a struggle to connect with your parents for whatever reason, being socially othered for all of these things. At least for me, this is a pretty one-to-one portrayal of my high school experience. Even Connor, within the same opening number, can be read as queer from the moment we see him. He's the family's problem child. He clearly sticks out like a sore thumb. He struggles with substance abuse and mental illness, both of which are more common within queer youth. He's a social outcast of his own kind, lashing out because he doesn't know how else to cope with his emotions, getting called a freak by his peers. And honestly, if all of that wasn't gay enough, then take one look at that outfit. That should tell you that he's queer. Yes, it's based on stereotypes and a purely vibe-based gaydar, but come the fuck on, look at that thing, you cannot tell me that I'm wrong. Though we don't meet him until after the opening number, even Evan's family friend Jared Kleinman can be read as queer from pretty early on within the story. Most of the queerness embedded within Jared's character doesn't show its face until later on, but considering one of his first appearances on stage is him joking about his friend jerking off, something, the people who are the most homophobic are secretly gay, and something, the ones who have nothing to hide won't joke about what they're trying to supposedly not hide. His relationship with Evan pretty quickly reads as a cliche gay bully/nerd ship dynamic. And of all of that, and the entirety of Waving Through a Window, like, just look at some of these lyrics, come on, wasn't gay enough already for you? We then get Connor and Evan's first major interaction with each other. Alone, in the computer lab, without anyone around to force them to play the rehearsed parts in the school's social hierarchy. Just the two of them. And holy fuck, the tension is palpable. Like, I can't be the only one who's seeing this, right? The first time we see anything even remotely resembling a genuine smile from Connor is with this.
You fell out of a tree. Well, that is just the saddest fucking thing I've ever heard. Oh my god. I know.
Which only comes after Evan offers Connor some genuine vulnerability instead of the hostility or apathy the two are accustomed to. At the slightest hint of a connection, the recognition of oneself and the other, Connor immediately opens up. In front of him, he sees a scared, socially outcast kid, just like himself. And Connor cares enough to try to bridge the gap between them. He does so by offering to sign Evan's cast, a permanent reminder of their interaction right there on Evan's arm for everyone to see. And against his better judgment, against his anxiety, Evan accepts the offer and gives Connor a Sharpie. He takes up basically the whole cast with his name, almost as if staking his claim on Evan and refusing to let anyone else take it from him. And after the silence, the physical and emotional connection, the tension of that whole moment, what does Connor say to Evan?
Yeah, but now we can both pretend that we have friends.
He looks down at his hands, fiddles with them as he says it. He all but states outright that this is some kind of friendship initiation for Connor. They can now pretend they're each other's friend. It's an acknowledgement that they're the same deep down, they're lonely and they don't want to be. It's an offer to bridge the gap and find some relief from that loneliness in one another. He uses the word friend, of course, but it doesn't take much squinting to read this as a nervous confession of sorts, as an admission of attraction and the realization that there's the potential for connection between one another. They know they're the same deep down, yet so different on the surface, and they both very clearly feel inexplicably drawn to each other. It's a common romance trope hiding in plain sight and playing out right in front of us. Connor then offers Evan's letter up to him, having to hype himself up to do so. It just reads so much like a kid hyping themselves up to ask their crush on a date. I mean, look at this. The chemistry is so immediately apparent, and even Connor and Evan seem to acknowledge it in their own ways. At the very least, they don't fight against it. But because the worst is all Connor has ever received from other people, he assumes the worst of Evan once he reads the letter, and any hope they might have had of bridging the gap is lost. Evan follows after Connor, of course trying to get his letter back, but there's a desperation in his voice that tells me that he knows he lost more than just the letter. He lost his only shot at a boy who could see him for who he is, understand him, and love him anyways. They both did. And it just keeps coming, really. Evan, in a panic, lies and claims to the Murphys that he and Connor would only hang out at Connor's house if there was nobody home, and that Connor didn't want people to know that he and Evan were friends because he was embarrassed. Does that not just sound like two closeted gay kids trying to have a relationship with one another? The audience knows this is all bullshit, of course, but that doesn't change the fact that Evan is the one to be making this all up. He's inserting himself into a very queer-sounding narrative, which brings us into For Forever. The sheer emotion in the music and the performance, the lyrics and the prospect of this perfect date, I mean day, Evan's small smile when he sings,
And everything's okay.
saying that the idea of Connor rescuing him is what made everything okay. Connor, the kid who almost did rescue him from himself. There's a lot to unpack about the way Evan goes about inserting himself into Connor's history and what Connor symbolizes to Evan. But in short, Connor is Evan's salvation. He finds love, a sense of worth, a sense of belonging, a purpose, and the kindness that another boy gave him, whether that kindness was real or not. That's pretty fucking gay, I think. Jared comes in to make sure that you didn't miss the obvious, and he outright states to Evan that
His parents think you were lovers, you realize that, right?
Jared's repeated gay jokes serve a bigger narrative purpose that we'll get to later, but it's clear that even he sees the tension between Connor and Evan, without even witnessing the one interaction they had when Connor was alive. Or at the very least, Jared sure loves to joke about it if Sincerely Me is anything to go off of.
But I should tell you that I think of you each night. I rub my nipples and start going with the lights. Why would you write that? I'm just trying to tell the truth. I gotta tell you, life without you has been hard, has been bad, has been rough, kinky.
And it's not just Jared pointing out the obvious. I think these kind of speak for themselves, really.
Our friendship goes beyond your average kind of fun, but not because we're gay. No, not because we're gay. We're close, but not that way. The only man that I love is my dad. Sincerely, miss you dearly. Sincerely.
If the musical didn't want you to think it was gay, it really should not have made so many jokes that are slapping you in the face with all of the gay parts. It stands out the most in Sincerely Me and the lead up to it, but throughout the whole musical, Jared sort of acts as an audience insert character, at least to some extent. He says what the audience is likely thinking, most notably when confronting Evan about how he's using Connor's death for his own gain. And honestly, that makes the fact that Jared's making this many gay jokes a lot funnier, because the implication is that it's coming from the audience. Jared's constant gay jokes are also making use of a writing tool called lampshading, which, according to tvtropes.org, is when an author, quote, deals with any element of the story that seems too dubious to take at face value, whether a very implausible plot development or a particularly blatant use of a trope, by calling attention to it and simply moving on, end quote. It's sort of like the author trying to poke fun at themselves, to nudge the audience in the shoulder and go, yeah, that's crazy, right? But don't worry too much about it, though. And use that as an excuse to move along with the story and call it a day. So the fact that Jared is lampshading all the queer subtext acts as a confirmation directly from the writers that yes, there is in fact queer subtext directly embedded within the writing, and no, you're not just imagining it. By lampshading the queer subtext, it makes it a lot less subtextual, and puts it directly into the text itself. Whether Dear Evan Hansen was intended to be queer or not, the lampshading made it queer. In an attempt to just brush off the queer subtext and move on, it solidified its identity as a piece of queer media. Although to be fair, it was really gay without the lampshading even. Its use of narrative foils definitely solidifies that as well. According to Wikipedia, a narrative character foil is, quote, a character who contrasts with another character, typically a character who contrasts with the protagonist, in order to better highlight or differentiate certain qualities of the protagonist, end quote. Think of it like two characters who are parallel to one another, whose stories, character arcs, and fates are irrefutably intertwined since the beginning of the narrative. Characters who are the same in many ways, but different in others. Characters who are purposefully meant to be understood in tandem with one another. Narrative foils are two characters who, without the other, have no story, no arc, no development. It's an incredibly strong storytelling tool, especially if you want to give two characters a relationship that's absolutely crucial to their individual arcs and the narrative as a whole. There's an inherent and almost romantic tension behind it, a push and pull, a yin and yang, because these characters are quite literally made for each other. So it's no big surprise that there's no shortage of romantic pairings of character foils. And that tension, that romantic spark of being made for one another, doesn't just magically disappear when the foils are the same gender. For reasons I honestly don't know how to explain, other than I just feel it in my soul and I'm gay, so I make the rules, it's almost more romantically tense when the character foils are the same gender. The kind of tension is baked into the characters and their influence on one another. That cannot be taken out. In short, I like to summarize this concept simply by saying the inherent homoeroticism of narrative foils. So let's jump back a little bit again. Think about the opening number. Anybody have a map? Both Connor and Evan are framed as problem children, albeit in different ways. They have near complete opposite family dynamics and structures, but the same core feeling of being isolated and distant from the family who's supposed to love and understand them. They're both loners, in their own ways. One is anxious, the other is confrontational. Everything about these two characters, from the moment they come on stage, puts them in relation with one another. It sets them up as equals, as the same, yet opposite. It frames them as narrative foils. And if you missed it earlier in the song, even the staging in Anybody Have a Map slaps it right in your face that these characters are meant to foil one another. They walk up together as their mothers share the same sentiment about them, and then walk off in opposite directions. Connor and Evan, from the start, are presented to the audience as existing in tandem with each other, unable to be separated. Their fates were intertwined from the start. And their fates just keep tangling and tangling further around each other's. Connor takes Evan's letter, and for all we know, that's the thing that pushed him over the edge into committing suicide. That letter is what drags Evan into lying to the Murphys. Evan's life is forever changed because of Connor's. And Connor's life was forever changed because of Evan's. There's that inherent tension, that pull they feel towards one another, in the scene where Connor signs Evan's cast. There's a reason that felt so romantically charged. Connor and Evan are narrative foils since the beginning, and thus, the inherent homoeroticism of it sure is at play here. So it's not just the plot and the things that happen in the musical that make it gay. Its queerness is directly embedded into the narrative and character structures themselves, equally as much as it is the plot. Which, speaking of, let's get back on track here. Once Alana, an acquaintance of Evan's who cares about the principle of preserving Connor's memory, puts pressure on Evan to make sure people don't forget about Connor, like they seem to be doing at this point in the plot, that's when things really start to get interesting. Evan sits alone in his room, and lo and behold, Connor Murphy appears. Not as a ghost, as is clarified later, but as Evan's subconscious. Evan is talking to himself, yet the other end of the conversation is manifesting as Connor. And honestly, this is one of the most fascinating plot decisions to me, from a narrative perspective mostly, but it's equally as interesting from the more isolated and more queer perspective of Evan's and Connor's relationship with one another. The fate that Evan wrote into existence for the two of them has made its way so deeply into him that he's willing it into his own reality. Evan never knew Connor. They spoke twice on stage and recognized the potential for a connection, but ultimately, Evan never knew Connor, and Connor never knew Evan. So the Connor that Evan's imagining here is not the real Connor. We don't know the real Connor. So Evan has no choice but to fill in the gaps, to project his own fake fairy tales onto this imagined Connor. The fact that it's Connor who manifests as this other half of Evan's subconscious is a really good narrative shorthand for showing that Evan refuses to confront himself directly about things, and it simultaneously tells the audience exactly what Evan wants, what he needs, and what he fears. Connor showed Evan one sliver of kindness in his life, and Evan was so desperately hungry for that love that he made up an entire idealized version of Connor who exists only to be Evan's friend. Evan used the empty memory of a Connor Murphy that nobody truly knew and filled in the blanks with his own desires, a past where Evan was loved and where he was cared for and understood, because nothing else in his life gave him that. He's using Connor to try and rewrite his own history, to give himself a better life than the one that he had, one where he found love and comfort in another boy, and that alone made everything okay, just like Evan said it did him for forever. Even if it's the idealized fictional Connor of Evan's imagination, there's a certain kinship that the two seem to have. The way the light comes up on them and they dance together and sincerely meet. The way Evan so desperately latches onto the idea of being Connor's friend once he realizes he can't out the truth that he wasn't. So Connor manifests as the other half of Evan's subconscious. The one that he can't confront himself yet. But it's easier to face when it's Connor, not yourself. Not only does Evan use Connor to make his own life better, he uses Connor to lie to himself. Connor is the better part of Evan's subconscious, the one that's more selfless, that isn't afraid to confront what lies underneath, and that's in line with what we saw of the true Connor who was alive. In the confrontation leading up to Disappear, Evan's imaginary Connor is still playing into what Evan tells himself about the situation. That others need him, that people won't care about Connor and others like him if Evan doesn't make them care. But Connor sprinkles in a few comments about Evans as well, like,
once they've forgotten about me, what do you think happens to you?
He tries to get Evan to dig, but ultimately, he comes short. Evan is too afraid to admit his desires for a better past, for a better present, for something selfish just once in his life, so the Connor he's imagined won't confront him about it yet either. And once Disappear begins, you're once again slapped in the face with the reality that Evan's actually just sitting alone in his bedroom, imagining that a boy who once showed him kindness is now telling him that he's loved, that he's worthy, that he's deserving of the right to matter in this world. You realize that Evan is so desperate for that kind of love, that he's imagining another boy giving it to him. And he finds comfort in that. He finds comfort in that tender love from another boy. But obviously no homo, right? It's around this point in the story that Evan truly realizes that he can use Connor for his own personal gain and still tell himself that it's for a selfless greater good. And with the birth of the Connor Project, Evan begins using and morphing Connor's memory to act as Evan's own personal salvation, as mentioned earlier. Evan needs Connor to give him hope, because Evan hates himself too much and is too lonely to give himself a sense of hope for his future. A sense of hope that even if Evan were to die without making a mark on the world, that he would still be remembered and appreciated. Both within his own mind, as shown with the imaginary Connor confrontation, and with the rest of the world, as shown through the Connor Project, Evan is using Connor as his only hope. This is what I meant when I touched on Connor's imagined presence being very telling of Evan's fears. His imagined Connor even specifically pointed them out to Evan. Evan's newfound desperation to keep Connor's memory alive, that was only sparked after Evan realized that he and Connor were too similar for their fates to be unalike, is born out of fear of being forgotten, of being nothing more than a speck of dust to the world. Evan projects this fear onto his imagined Connor. Ultimately, Evan doesn't know whether Connor feared being forgotten in the same way Evan does, but Evan latches onto the idea that Connor can't be forgotten. Because if Connor, the loser, can be remembered, then Evan, the loser, can too. He uses the idea of another boy who could love and understand him to make himself feel worthy of love, to make himself feel hope for the future, to give himself some kindness that the world denied him. The lie of being friends with Connor gradually becomes less and less about Connor and the Murphy family, and more about Evan's own fears and his needs to be loved and understood. Evan was so desperate for the love and understanding of another boy like him that he made one up entirely and effectively rewrote history to make his love real. Evan is using Connor to feel love. Evan needs Connor to love him. He finds his life's meaning in the life of another boy. One who could have, and maybe did, love him. Even the staging for Disappear and the confrontation before it is pretty gay. There's a very clear chemistry between the two. Connor repeatedly leans in close to Evan, is so gentle with him, smiles so softly at him. The way the world around them fades into nothing, should I say passes by, as they walk towards each other. That small nod, Connor offering his hand to Evan as he references Evan's own suicide attempt, Connor lifting him up and throwing him right into the Connor Project discussion. There's so much chemistry and tension on stage between the characters, and it's so obvious that the actors play right into it perfectly. And I guess now is as good a time as any to point out that Evan's imaginary Connor wears a different outfit than the real Connor. He wears a dark gray hoodie in Evan's imagination, as opposed to the layered dark jackets he wore in his life. And later on in the musical, we see Evan wearing that exact same hoodie. So Evan's imagining Connor in his own hoodie. You know, like the cliche of romantic partners sharing each other's clothes. I'm pretty sure it was meant to act as a visual shorthand to tell the audience that this isn't in fact the real Connor and is instead the one Evan imagined, but the Connor that Evan imagines is pretty fucking gay, so... At the end of Disappear, Cynthia, Connor's mom, offers Evan a tie that Connor was given as a kid, but never had the chance to wear. Evan reluctantly accepts, and there's a long moment where he sits in silence in Connor's bedroom, just staring at the tie. I'll play it, unedited, as I'm talking here. Once Evan finally resolves to wear the tie and make a speech for the Connor Project assembly, he's visibly crying. And it makes that long, heavy silence all the more heavy. It reads as Evan, for once, actually grieving Connor and giving himself the space to do so. To realize that this is a person, a whole life he's co-opting, a whole life he's trying to use to better the lives of himself and everyone around him. A person that nobody ever truly knew, and one that Evan will now never get the chance to know. What Evan sees when he looks at that tie is his future. Either one that awaits him down the line, or the one that almost came to be when he let go of the tree branch, fell, and broke his arm. Evan's seeing the future of a kid who died an unknown nobody, and realizing that nobody will ever truly know or love him. So they'll have no choice but to move on from him. And Evan resolves to make sure that that will not be Connor's fate, and thus to make sure that it won't be his own. And during the speech for the Connor Project, when Evan drops his cue cards and begins to panic, it's specifically looking at Connor's tie that gives him the strength to compose himself again and tell the story of the day at the orchard. The story that For Forever established. There's a strength in Connor's memory that Evan finds in himself. Evan gains confidence, hope, a sense of worth, all because of the idea that another boy like himself cared about him in the past. Dear Evan Hansen is nothing if not the epitome of tonal whiplash, and the beginning of the second half opens with a short reprise of Sincerely Me, where Jared is immediately back to being Jared. I'll never not laugh at how Jared is the one to make Connor seem so scared by the stories of sucking dick for meth at rehab, despite Jared being the one to make all the jokes that Connor was gay with Evan. I don't know, it's hilarious to me. But a more interesting show of Jared's true character comes directly after, when he starts trying to insert himself into the narrative he and Evan have spun around his friendship with Connor. Which is still hilarious, of course, because why do you want to be a part of the friendship you've routinely called gay, huh, Jared? You sure you aren't writing those emails from your closet? It's funny, and of course the musical itself plays this all up for laughs, but there's a lot more to be said about Jared's character in this moment that sets up the rest of his character, and thus the queer coding in his character, incredibly well. It's one of the first major hints that Jared is just as lonely as Connor and Evan were. It's the first sign that Jared is actually desperate to be a part of something, too. Even if it's with his lame family friend, Evan. Honestly, Jared and Evan also have a lot of gay tension, with their narrative roles as well as their characters themselves. All the teasing remarks about Connor and Evan sounding like lovers has the potential to be read as jealousy from Jared, as if he wishes he had something, someone, like the thing that he's helping give to Evan, but the only way he knows how to cope with that desperation is to crack a snarky joke about it. Evan's shown to desperately cling to anyone who gives him attention. Like, just look at what he's done with Connor. But even after he gains that attention through the Connor Project, he still keeps coming back to Jared. Yes, Evan's only using him at this point, but if he's using the idea of Connor caring for him to give himself hope, why can't he be doing the same with Jared, just to a lesser extent? Evan seems aware of the fact that he owes all of this to Jared, and he continually returns to him. Jared, who claims to have it all and to not need anyone, keeps coming back to Evan time and time again, because ultimately, at their cores, they are the same. Jared is lonely, just like Evan. And Jared does help Evan time and time again, regardless of whether he's personally invested or not. He cares, and I think the confrontation he has with Evan after the Sincerely Me reprise is actually a very good showcase of how much Jared cares and how he shows that care, in a tough love sort of way. They treat each other poorly, and the relationship devolves into a cruel codependency as the musical develops. Evan uses Jared for the Connor project, and Jared uses Evan to elevate his own ego. But ultimately, they still need each other. They recognize that they are the same deep down, and thus have nothing if they let each other go. That, and everything Evan's built up around his relationship with Connor, everything that Evan clings to, would fall apart if it weren't for Jared's help with the emails. Even Jared, after reaching out in a bid for connection, offering to have some drinks with Evan, he calls Evan out for using the memory of a kid who committed suicide as his own personal salvation.
You know, when you really stop and think about it, Connor being dead, that's pretty much the best thing that's ever happened to you.
This, of course, could also be read as jealousy from Jared, alongside the sense of betrayal he feels from Evan's poor treatment of him. But at the same time, it just serves to reinforce what we already know about Evan's relationship with Connor. That Evan being able to have a loving relationship, even a fake one, with another boy, was, in fact, the best thing that ever happened to him. Later, in the spoken interludes between Good For You's verses, we see everything that Jared and Evan's relationship has been building up to. The fact that they are the same, but they refuse to admit it. Jared very clearly found some kind of comfort in the lies about Connor, too. He found some kind of friendship, however fucked it may be, in Evan. Jared is lonely and hurt, but he lashes out where Evan implodes. Though the framing isn't anywhere near as strong as it is with Evan and Connor, if someone were to make the argument that Evan and Jared were the narrative foils, I can't argue against that. It's the same idea. Characters who are similar at their cores, yet different in many ways, who wouldn't be where they are without the other. And to an extent, Jared's relationship with Evan mirrors Evan's relationship with Connor. Jared found comfort in somebody else who he barely knew, but knew just well enough to know that he was alone and hurt in the same ways he was. Jared never seemed to care all that much for Evan until he felt needed by Evan, until Jared needed Evan to fill the loneliness. Which makes Evan's attack against Jared all the more poignant. Evan attacks Jared, saying,
"Oh, maybe the only reason you talk to me, Jared, is because you don't have any other friends."
I could tell everyone everything!
Wait, you go ahead, do that! Tell everyone now you helped write emails pretending to be a kid who killed himself!
Even though that's the exact same thing, Evan did as well. And Jared's forced to reflect on himself, which he seems to usually try to avoid, and he's forced to see that the scared kid that he once thought he was better than is now challenging him. Now proving that Jared is actually the scared and fragile kid. His only response,
Fuck you, Evan! Asshole!
has so much more bite to it than it would if he were someone who just lost a family friend he didn't give much of a shit about. It has the amount of poison in it that someone who just lost their only friend, maybe someone more than that, would have. It's the sharpness of betrayal from the only person who could ever dream of understanding you. And Evan has to watch himself burn the bridges he never really earned, but so desperately craved all this time. And Evan, of course, is left with no choice but to turn to his savior, his Connor. Except by now, Evan's starting to realize that there's nothing left of him and his relationships to save from this. So Connor takes the role of his conscience again, and finally breaks down the walls within himself. It's Connor who frees Evan from himself, who breaks down the internal barriers, who pushes Evan into self-acceptance and honesty. The better part of Evan's conscience, the one that truly wants to fix things, manifests as Connor. And it's the boy who he made to love him, telling him that he now has to let go of all of it if he's truly to get what he wants. To truly be loved is to be loved for who you truly are, not the lies you told yourself and everyone around you. And Evan knows this, and he can't keep up the charade anymore. And the subject of his affection, the reason he built the whole charade in the first place, is the one he sees telling him to let it all go. I think the acknowledgement that Evan is talking to himself when he talks to his imagined Connor is important narratively, and for understanding their relationship. It's further confirmation that this is in no way, shape, or form the Connor who once lived. This is a Connor of Evan's creation, and Evan's creation alone. The real Connor did not save Evan. Evan's Connor did. And this Connor is blunt, is desperate for something better than the hand he was dealt, but in his own way, he's real. He's real in the sense that he's honest with Evan in a way that Evan doesn't know how to be with himself. And that's still in line with what we knew of the real Connor, which only emphasizes the potential that they had to be a good relationship, and it makes it sting all the more when you realize that this entirely fictional version of Connor is what allows Evan to finally face reality.
You can't even tell yourself the truth.
What are you talking about?
How'd you break your arm? How'd you break your arm, Evan?
I fell.
Really? Is that what happened?
Yes, I lost my grip and then I fell, so.
Did you fall? Or did you let go?
Connor Murphy, the kid who committed suicide, the one who became a martyr for Evan Hansen through no choice of his own, is the one that Evan imagines to confront his own suicide attempt. The kid that Evan has been using this whole time to find hope in is the one Evan imagines confronting him about his own hopelessness. They're the same, and Evan knows it, and he can't run from it anymore. They're the same, and their fates will be the same, and Evan has to do something real about it. Evan can't hold on to a fake life if his real one is to end better than Connor's. Connor would be nothing without Evan. And Evan would be nothing without Connor. It's a prime example of the character foils at play. And as if to offer one last goodbye, as if to remind Evan of the truth in a way that's actually bitter enough to get through to him, Connor reprises For Forever with Evan. He smiles so softly at him. He brings him in for a little hug. He truly sounds as if he's remembering the day they shared, with such a fondness for Evan that he can't help it from overflowing out of him. But that's the Connor that Evan wanted him to be. And it's the one Evan now inescapably realizes that he cannot have. And it's over. Everything starts to fall apart for Evan once Connor walks away from him. The rest of the musical plays out. Evan confesses to the Murphys, reconciles with Heidi, you know the drill, which leads us into finale. Evan, roughly a year later, finally visits the orchard he helped build in Connor's name, and he tells Zoe that he found an old yearbook with Connor's 10 favorite books in it, and he's trying to read them all. Even though Evan is well aware that he can never truly know the real Connor, and at this point, no one ever will, and that's all Evan's fault, he still tries to get to know whatever he can. Because that moment they shared in the computer lab before Connor's suicide was still real. Because everything that the idea of Connor had given to Evan was, for at least a moment, still real. Because their fates are still intertwined irreversibly, and they were kindred spirits whether they knew it or not. And what else can someone do to grieve with the loss of someone you never knew but convinced yourself you did? There's a moment where Evan looks at Connor, now standing with the Murphys, as the song shifts into another reprise of For Forever. And the show ends with Evan, alone as he always was, but still intertwined with Connor as he always was. Still honoring him in whatever way he can, singing For Forever.
All I see is sky for forever.
Honestly, I'm a bawling mess every time I listen to Finale. It's a messy ending, but I think that works well for the story the musical is trying to tell. And Connor and Evan were likely never going to get anything but a messy ending. They're messy people. So is Jared, and unfortunately we don't get to know what his relationship with Evan is like in the current day, but they still share something that binds them together no matter what. They're the only two who know everything that happened. They're the only two who will ever know about the emails, the truth, everything. And really, Connor and Evan might be the only people who could ever truly know each other, even though they didn't know each other at all. Everyone gets a messy ending, but it's a real ending. And I think that resonated with young queer teens, myself included, in such a uniquely powerful way that, honestly, I'm not sure I know how to describe. From its characters and their relationships down to the narrative structure and storytelling tools, Dear Evan Hansen is undoubtedly a queer story. At least it is shockingly easy to read it as one. There's queerness embedded within its very themes, and many queer kids today deal with a lot of the same things that the show does. Social media and an online presence, mental illness, loneliness, pretending there's someone they aren't, latching on to whatever love they can get for dear life, dragging others down with them when this unsustainable, half-full fulfillment falls apart. All of it just rings so true to the queer teen I was, and in some ways, probably still am. Or maybe I was just 14 when I first saw the musical, and all of this is in my head. Who knows? If nothing else, the musical really resonated with me. And I'm queer. And I spent hours combing through it to find all the queerness I could, and that's gonna have to count for at least something. Dear Evan Hansen, the novel, was released in May 2017, adapting the original text of the musical into a novel format, done with the intent of making the story more accessible for the average person who can't afford to hit up a theater. The overall plot stays the same, save for a few additional scenes to flesh it out more and fill a novel-length book. There are a few notable changes, though, the most notable of which being that the real Connor is given his own perspective. There are a few chapters scattered throughout the novel that are written in the first-person perspective of the ghost of Connor Murphy. Not one that Evan imagines, but the real Connor Murphy, haunting the story, telling his own, and watching everything go down. Most chapters are written through the first-person perspective of Evan himself, and it focuses primarily on his internal dialogue. There's a lot that I think it gets right, both as a general narrative and from the lens of preserving the queerness the original musical had, but there's a lot that I think it tends to fall short in. Regardless, Evan and Connor remain as queer-coded as they were in the musical. Connor even more so, to be honest. Connor's internal monologue, even the first we see from him, which comes directly after he dies in the hospital, it establishes him as the other. The emo kid who does drugs and reads philosophy books and does nothing but cause problems until he kills himself. Evan is the same, still being introduced as this anxious kid who's struggling to find his place in the world. And it doesn't take long for the narration itself to lean into framing the two as the narrative foils they are, with Connor's internal dialogue mentioning the feeling of free-falling right before his death, just like Evan fell from the tree during his suicide attempt, and with Connor seeing Heidi in the hospital after his death. Connor even mentions that he specifically reached out to Evan because he saw himself in Evan, thought that Evan might be the only one who could understand, who could help. The novel takes what was subtext in the musical, because we're never granted Connor's perspective, and makes it text. When an old photo of Connor is floating around social media, he's described as wearing a striped polo shirt that sounds eerily reminiscent of the one Evan wears in the musical. And later, at least in the musical, Evan wears the black hoodies and layers that Connor came to be known for. As well, there's another person in that photo of Connor, but they've been cropped out for the most part. At one point, Alana asks Evan if the other person in the photo is him, and Evan doesn't have it in him to deny this. This is made funnier and gayer with the later reveal that the other person in the photo is another boy that Connor was canonically romantically interested in. And Connor, in the most literal sense of the word, haunts Evan throughout the novel. Despite Connor actually being canonically queer without a doubt in the novel, I found myself grasping at more straws in it, reading into smaller details to find the queerness within them, and probably reaching a little too far with it. But one thing it did, without a doubt, blatantly retain is the inherent homoeroticism of narrative foils with Connor and Evan. For Forever, or at least the non-song variant of it in the novel, follows the same events that the song does and is equally as desperately gay. Jared continues his lampshading, once again making the already queer subtext into more explicit text. The novel does more to place us into Evan's shoes more directly, to give us his thought processes through it all. And it does more to try and give Evan a real connection with the real Connor. Or it does more to make Evan seek a connection with the real Connor, instead of latching on so desperately to an imagined Connor. The novel does a lot to emphasize the potential that Evan and Connor had. The idea that had Connor not read the letter and taken it so poorly, he and Evan could have actually been friends. The idea that they read the same books, had similar interests, similar social standings. The idea that Evan was the last one to have a genuine moment with Connor. And the idea of them being friends not being as crazy as Evan might have once thought. Heidi and Cynthia still seem to view their children as problems to be fixed. At least that's how Evan and Connor both view it. The emotional distance from their fathers, how Evan still uses Connor for his own salvation. The novel is just a lot less in your face about it, I guess? Because there are also a lot of decisions that work to tone down the queerness of the story. The main one being that there is no imagined Connor. Yes, there is something undeniably gay about Connor's ghost directly haunting Evan, but it doesn't have the same desperation as Evan directly using the idea of Connor to feel loved, by imagining him cradling his face and telling him no one deserves to be forgotten. In terms of showing Connor and Evan's relationship, the novel focuses too much on what could have been, and forgets to acknowledge that the story is meant to focus on what currently is. So it doesn't give them as much room to breathe, and the internal dialogue we get from both Connor and Evan ends up feeling more impersonal and contrived more than anything. You'd think getting Connor's perspective and directly seeing how similar he and Evan are would make it gayer, but they take away from the existing gay moments in the musical to make room for Connor's less gay ones, as well as make room for Zoe and Evan's relationship, which honestly has so little to it. Both in the musical and novel, there's no chemistry between the two that exists outside of Connor and Evan's connections to him. We're told that it does, and the novel tries extra hard to give them chemistry, but it doesn't really succeed. Especially when that chemistry comes at the cost of Evan's moments regarding Connor. The scene where Cynthia gives Evan Connor's tie still happens in the novel, but there's so little weight to it. Evan barely gets a moment to sit with the weight of it all before Zoe walks in and they start talking about their relationship. In the novel, Evan doesn't get the idea for the Connor project from his imagined Connor. It instead comes from a random documentary Evan was watching. I don't even remember what it was about. It's more removed from the characters and their motivations. It's more impersonal. Connor's internal dialogue doesn't do much to add to this either. We get a few moments of Connor having his hope pinned on Evan and realizing that he and Evan were and are similar, and he seems to mostly just be confused and apathetic about Evan's actions after his death. But that doesn't do enough for their existing post-suicide dynamic to replace what the novel takes away. It doesn't take all of the queerness away from it, though. There's the way that Ghost Connor keeps expecting his love interest Miguel to show up, but it consistently ends up being Evan that he runs into instead. The way that Connor empathizes with Evan when he drops his cue cards during the Connor Project's opening speech, and the way that Evan uses the idea of Connor more explicitly in that same moment to compel himself forward. They're very clearly having an impact on one another, the current day real states of one another, in their own way. And there's something to be said for the queerness of that direct relationship and impact, as opposed to the only indirect impact that Connor has on Evan in the musical. That, and a lot of what made Evan's attachment to Connor so queer in the musical is still retained in the novel, but it's seen most explicitly during the assembly speech of You Will Be Found. The idea of another boy, Connor, caring about Evan is what makes Evan feel like he is capable of mattering in the world. Even Jared and Evan keep most of their character arcs together and the queerness that exists within that, and it adds a few extra moments of them being close as childhood friends, which just sort of adds to the level of understanding and connection they have with one another. What's interesting about the novel is that we actually get to see some of Evan's attachment to Connor being reciprocated. After Evan confesses to the Murphys that he wrote the letter, we get a chapter of Connor's perspective from the event, and we watch him follow Evan. And Connor can't help but see himself in Evan. He feels compelled to help him in whatever way he can. He knows it's likely pointless, but he can't stop himself from trying. There's that inherent and inexplicable draw to one another that comes with being narrative foils. Just as Evan uses Connor to find comfort and closure, Connor looks at Evan's situation and finds some closure for himself within it. They use each other to better themselves. And Connor does save Evan, just like Evan needed him to. It's Connor's words that get Evan up and away from the center of the road, saving him from the oncoming car and his second suicide attempt. It's Connor's words that get Evan to confront himself about the previous suicide attempt, about not just falling from the tree, but purposefully letting go. I do think there's some queer tension lost here by not having even an imagined Connor directly confront him, but there's still an intertwining, a mutual dependence on the ideas of one another, a mutual salvation and closure and growth that's found in one another that the novel does not let you deny. The most explicitly queer part of the novel is in the entirely original character of Miguel and his relationship with Connor. In the chapters from Connor's perspective, he reflects on a friend he had in his life, one of the only ones he ever truly had. They went to an all-boys private school together, became lab partners for a project, shared philosophy books and interests with one another, and the rest is history. It follows all the romantic cliches you expect it to follow after that point. And there's a certain reverence in the way that Connor reminisces on him. And Miguel seems to have shared that reverence for Connor, saying that he believed Connor was innocent in a way nobody else was. Miguel was found out by his parents in school to have weed on him, and Connor willingly took the blame for it, saving Miguel from expulsion from the school, which, come on, sacrificing your future for another boy's? That's pretty gay. Connor is desperate for Miguel. He's the only person who gets Connor, who sees something worth spending time on in him, and Miguel seems to feel similarly about Connor, in the sense that Connor gives Miguel something he craves that he can't find anywhere else in his life. It's heavily implied that they were in a sexual relationship with one another, in a situationship, friends with benefits type relationship, though their friendship fell apart due to the walls that Connor put up and couldn't tear down. It's revealed that Connor texted Miguel before his suicide, and when Miguel didn't respond, Connor went ahead with his plan. Evan was his last hope, and then Miguel was his last hope, and neither came through for Connor until it was too late. It's tragic gaze doomed by the narrative at its finest. Miguel is also explicitly mentioned to be the only person who was openly gay that Connor had known, and Connor admits to himself that his sexuality is fluid. Connor admits he began to act on those feelings, more specifically with Miguel, and this gets elaborated on from Miguel's perspective in the novel's epilogue. Miguel approaches Evan in the epilogue, recognizing him as the guy from the Connor Project, and Miguel explains as much as he can to Evan. He calls Connor a friend, even though they were very clearly more than that to anybody with a brain cell. He speaks fondly of Connor, saying he was just happy to see that Connor had another friend, and he explains that he was trying to text Connor back. He simply wasn't able to in time due to being at work. The novel, with its framing and the weight placed on the conversation, leans into the idea that Evan pretended to be for Connor what Miguel actually was for him. I think the idea that Connor did actually have this relationship with Miguel takes away from some of the queerness in his gayer relationship with Evan. If Connor actually had somebody who loved him like that, when Evan never had anybody like that at all, it makes them less similar. It works against the narrative it had already built up with Evan and Connor. And Miguel's entire character feels shoehorned in, he feels very last minute, and overall it only serves to hurt the novel's cause instead of supporting it. Connor felt more explicitly, more deeply, more really queer in the musical than he did when he actually had a gay, romantic, and/or sexual relationship, because there was so little chemistry within it. The relationship exists, and it's not poorly written, but it isn't given the proper reason to exist. It doesn't serve the narrative, while the narrative completely hinges on Connor and Evan's relationship. It sacrifices the queerness within its DNA, within the very structure of the narrative, for an awkwardly shoved-in diversity win, and a way to claim it has good queer representation. We're helping you guys, we're on your side, folks, woo! Miguel and Connor are a perfectly fine relationship, don't get me wrong. They're the most compelling part of the novel, as far as I'm concerned, honestly. But there's just something in the way Miguel disrupts the narrative structure that serves to make the novel feel less queer at its core, despite technically making it more queer by making that queerness explicitly stated outright. Ultimately, the novel is fine. You're not missing much if you don't give it a read. And as far as I'm concerned, the musical is gayer anyways. I don't know, musical theater, am I right? Curiosity killed the cat, and in this case, it sent the cat searching for interviews with the writers of the musical to see if the queerness within the writing was intentional or not. And as far as this cat could find, it wasn't. Like, at all. There are interviews and articles where the existing queer themes and how the story was claimed by the queer community are acknowledged, but I couldn't find anything that points to such themes being intentionally and purposefully embedded into the writing. As far as I can tell, Dear Evan Hansen is that aggressively gay entirely by accident. One of the writers, Benj Pasek, is a gay man, and it sounds like he appreciates the queerness that was later found within the story, but there was nothing to suggest that that experience made it into the musical, especially not with any intention. There was even an official study guide made for students and teachers who went to see the musical through school field trips, and the only mention of queerness in it is briefly mentioning the Trevor Project, both as a resource for queer youth and as the inspiration for the name of the Connor Project. By all accounts, the writers wanted to tell a story about connection, community, self-acceptance, which are all very queer ideals at their cores, but none of the queerness within it was ever purposefully acknowledged or intended at all. At least not until the novel's release, where it seems like the writers sort of just rolled with it and allowed the novel author, Val Emmich, to do his own thing with Connor's queerness. There's an argument to be made that the novel's characterization of the real Connor is still flawed, and the sense that the musical only gives us Evan's Connor to work with, so that was likely all that Emmich had too. That, of course, is going to impact how Emmich writes the real Connor. It's easier to work with what you've already got than make something new and risk it becoming an entirely different story in the process. So to say that this isn't actually the real Connor, that the novel draws too heavily from Evan's imagined Connor, it's a little unnecessarily meta as far as I'm concerned, but it's a point that's still worth acknowledging. The whole point of the musical is that we don't know the real Connor. So ultimately, who are we to say if the novel's Connor is wrong? But anyways, the takeaway is that all of the gay jokes in Dear Evan Hansen were, in fact, nothing more than quick jokes, and the story, despite all its queerness, was never intended to be queer. And honestly, the fact that they wrote something this gay without trying to is its own kind of impressive. Even though Dear Evan Hansen itself was never intended to be queer, one thing that queer people do best is take media that resonates with them and they make it queer, and they don't let anyone tell them otherwise. And that is exactly what happened with the Dear Evan Hansen fandom. Queerness in online fandom spaces was already incredibly prevalent, but in 2016, when Dear Evan Hansen debuted on Broadway, it was starting to really hit its peak of prominence. At least as far as I was witnessing in the online spaces that I occupied. Common fandom spaces like Twitter and Tumblr had already made queerness and queerships a very prominent part of fandom, and fanfictions have been carrying the backs of fandoms for years, and Lord knows most of those aren't straight. So when Dear Evan Hansen came along, queer people flocked to it like a moth to a rainbow flame. People in fandom were latching onto anything queer they could possibly find, or they were making it queer themselves and finding queer subtext in themes where the writers may not have intended it. And people were definitely finding it in Dear Evan Hansen. Not that you have to look all that hard for it. The most popular ship was Connor x Evan, lovingly dubbed Tree Bros by the fandom. Out of 5,752 total Dear Evan Hansen fanfics on Archive of Our Own, 2,907 of them are tagged as Tree Bros. On YouTube, fan animatics to songs from popular musicals were a massively popular subsection of their fandoms, and countless artists were making animatics using the characters and songs from their favorite musicals. And Dear Evan Hansen was no exception to this rising trend. Even if they aren't explicitly labeled as Tree Bros animatics, it won't take you much searching at all to find one that pretty explicitly makes Connor and Evan romantically interested in one another. Fandom did as fandom does, and everyone made AUs, animatics, fan art, fics, you name it. But a few more popular animatic artists on YouTube seem to ship Tree Bros pretty fervently, which might have contributed to its popularity. If you'd only come in contact with the Dear Evan Hansen fandom in passing, it was likely a Tree Bros fan work you came across. Evan X Jared, or Kleinsen, was the second most popular ship in the fandom, with a whopping 1,160 fics tagged with it on AO3. It had no shortage of animatics and fanworks of all kinds, too. Hell, even just one quick YouTube search of Tree Bros or Kleinsen, and you'll have a mountain of fanworks to satisfy the shipper in you. The show blew up rather rapidly, in large part due to the rapid growth of its online fandom, and as someone who lived through the rise of the fandom as a young teen, I think a lot of that can be attributed to its queerness. Fandoms are very queer spaces, especially musical theater fandoms, so when they saw a musical that they felt reflected their experiences and who they were, they latched onto it hard, as did everyone around them. So much so that fandom perception of the musical started to overtake the musical's own marketing and public perception in general. This got to the point where, when the first trailer for the movie adaptation dropped, hundreds of thousands of people took to social media confused because they thought the show was about a young gay kid, and they were really surprised to learn it was actually about teen suicide. It was such a phenomenon that there were articles written about it. Obviously, I have no way of knowing for sure, but I have a feeling that this was largely due to how widespread and prevalent the fandom was, and how intensely they latched onto the queerness of Dear Evan Hansen. I've even spoken with people who, to this day, and maybe not until watching this video, did not realize that Dear Evan Hansen wasn't explicitly queer. But if you ask anybody who's a fan, they'll tell you that in one way or another, yeah, the show is definitely queer. So, no. Dear Evan Hansen is not actually about a gay kid. But, yes, it also is actually about a gay kid. Regardless of the author's intentions, it's really not hard at all to find queerness oozing out of every corner of Dear Evan Hansen, both the original musical and the novel adaptation. And find it people did, if the public reception of the story is anything to go off of. Dear Evan Hansen is a mess of a story in a million different ways. But honestly, I think that's one of the main things that makes it so compelling and makes it resonate so strongly with people, specifically queer youth. Unnecessarily long story short, yes, Dear Evan Hansen is fucking gay.